Gentlemen, the end is here. Sorry for everything I've done. I love you all.
This was the most heartbreaking performance in Elvis's history.
One sentence, 7 devastating words. That's all it took to shatter the most famous family in America forever. What you're about to witness happened behind the gates of Graceland on a stormy night in 1972, when the king of rock and roll became something far more terrifying than any stage persona. The words that exploded from Elvis Presley's mouth that night left Priscilla stunned, 4-year-old Lisa Marie traumatized, and witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about their beloved boss. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single moment destroyed 8 years of marriage and changed the Presley family forever. But first, smash that subscribe button because what we're about to reveal will shock you to your core. The king behind closed doors. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Graceland as Elvis Aaron Presley paced the living room like a caged animal. It was 2:47 in the morning, and America's most beloved entertainer had just returned from what witnesses described as one of his worst performances ever. The pills weren't working anymore. The applause felt hollow. The screaming fans seemed more like vultures than admirers. But none of that mattered now because the real performance was about to begin, and this time, there would be no standing ovation. Inside these walls, Elvis wasn't the gyrating hip sensation or the crooning heartthrob. He was a 37-year-old man drowning in his own success, suffocating under the weight of expectations that had grown heavier with each passing year. The king, who commanded stages and sold millions of records, couldn't even control his own household. And that reality was eating him alive from the inside out. Priscilla sat in the kitchen, still in her nightgown, feeding 4-year-old Lisa Marie a late-night snack. She had learned to read the signs, the way Elvis slammed doors. The particular heavy footsteps that meant trouble was brewing, the dangerous quiet that always preceded the storm. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight carried an electricity that made her skin crawl and her maternal instincts scream warnings she couldn't quite understand yet. The staff had already disappeared into the shadows, a survival mechanism they had perfected over years of witnessing Elvis's volcanic temper. They knew when to become invisible, when to pretend they hadn't heard the shouting, when to clean up broken glass without asking questions. But tonight, even their practiced avoidance couldn't protect them from what was coming. Lisa Marie giggled at something only a child would find amusing, her innocent laughter echoing through the mansion like music from another world. She had no idea that her father was spiraling into a darkness that would soon engulf them all. She couldn't understand that the pills scattered across his bathroom counter were stealing pieces of his soul every single day. All she knew was that Daddy seemed sad lately, and Mommy's smiles looked more like masks than expressions of joy. The tension in Graceland that night was so thick you could taste it. Every creak of the old house seemed amplified. Every shadow looked more ominous than usual. Even the portraits of Elvis's beloved mother Gladys seemed to be watching with worried eyes, as if somehow sensing that their golden boy was about to commit an act that would haunt this family for generations to come. The perfect storm, fame's deadly price. Elvis had been performing for nearly 20 years, but success had become a prison with golden bars. Colonel Parker, his manager, pushed him relentlessly. Tour after tour, show after show, with barely enough time to breathe between performances. The pills started as a way to keep up with the demands, uppers to get through the shows, downers to fall asleep afterward, and everything in between to numb the growing emptiness that fame couldn't fill. Behind the sequined jumpsuits and million-dollar smile, Elvis was disappearing piece by piece. The boy from Tupelo who just wanted to make his mama proud had been consumed by an image that demanded perfection 24 hours a day. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. He couldn't have a normal conversation without someone wanting something from him. He couldn't even be a father without the whole world watching and judging his every move. The financial pressures were crushing him despite his enormous earnings. The mansion required constant maintenance. The staff needed salaries. The cars, the jets, the gifts he couldn't stop buying for everyone around him. Money flowed out as fast as it came in, and Elvis felt like he was running on a treadmill that never stopped. The faster he ran, the further behind he seemed to fall. Priscilla watched her husband transform from the charming young man she had fallen in love with into a stranger she barely recognized. The drugs had changed his personality completely. One moment he could be tender and loving, the next he could explode into rage over something as simple as a misplaced remote control. She never knew which version of Elvis would walk through the door each night. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of their fame. They couldn't go to movies like normal couples. They couldn't take Lisa Marie to the park without causing a riot. They couldn't have friends over without worrying about betrayal or leaked stories to the tabloids. Graceland had become both a sanctuary and a prison, protecting them from the outside world while slowly suffocating them in the process. Sleep had become Elvis's enemy. The prescription cocktail that once helped him rest now kept him awake for days at a time. He would wander the halls of Graceland like a ghost, talking to portraits on the walls, reliving conversations with people who weren't there, spiraling deeper into paranoia and depression. Priscilla often found him standing in Lisa Marie's doorway at 3 in the morning, just watching their daughter sleep, tears streaming down his face for reasons he couldn't or wouldn't explain. The warning signs had been there for months, maybe even years, but everyone around Elvis had become experts at pretending everything was normal. The staff looked the other way. The friends enabled his behavior. The doctors kept writing prescriptions, and Priscilla kept hoping that somehow, someway, she could save the man she had once loved so desperately. Priscilla's impossible world. Priscilla Presley had married a dream and woken up in a nightmare. At 27 years old, she was simultaneously the most envied woman in America and the loneliest wife in Memphis. Her days were spent managing a household that functioned more like a small corporation, complete with employees who looked to her for guidance while secretly reporting her every move to their unpredictable boss. She had learned to walk on eggshells without making a sound. Elvis's moods changed like weather patterns, and Priscilla had become a meteorologist of his emotions, constantly reading the atmospheric pressure around her husband to predict when the next storm would hit. A wrong word, a misplaced item, even a look he interpreted the wrong way could trigger an explosion that would leave everyone in the house traumatized. Managing Graceland required skills they never taught in finishing school. She supervised a staff of dozens, coordinated Elvis's chaotic schedule, handled his fan mail, managed his personal finances, and somehow still found time to be a mother to Lisa Marie. Every decision had to be filtered through Elvis's approval, even choices about their daughter's bedtime or what she ate for breakfast. The control was suffocating, but challenging it meant risking his wrath. Lisa Marie had become Priscilla's anchor in the storm. Protecting their daughter from Elvis's increasingly erratic behavior required constant vigilance. Priscilla would distract Lisa Marie during his worst episodes, create elaborate games to keep her occupied when Daddy was having his bad days, and tell bedtime stories that painted Elvis as the hero he used to be rather than the troubled man he had become. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part to bear. Priscilla couldn't confide in friends because Elvis monitored her every relationship. She couldn't seek help from family because it would mean admitting that the fairy tale marriage was actually a disaster. She couldn't even cry in private because the staff might report her tears to Elvis, who would either rage about her disloyalty or spiral deeper into guilt and self-pity. But something had been changing in Priscilla over the past year. The frightened young woman who had once trembled at Elvis's raised voice was slowly being replaced by a mother who would do anything to protect her child. She had started standing up to Elvis in small ways, testing the boundaries of his control, discovering that she was stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The breaking point was approaching like a freight train, and Priscilla could feel it in her bones. She had given Elvis everything she had to give. She had sacrificed her youth, her dreams, her identity, all in service of his needs and his image. But she would not sacrifice Lisa Marie. That was the line she would not allow him to cross, even if it meant facing the full fury of the king's wrath. Tonight felt different from all the other difficult nights. Tonight carried a weight that pressed down on her chest like a physical force. As she sat in the kitchen with Lisa Marie, listening to Elvis pace upstairs, Priscilla made a decision that would change everything. She was done being afraid. The spark when everything went wrong. The argument started over something so trivial that later, no one could believe it had led to such devastation. Lisa Marie had refused to go to sleep, a perfectly normal behavior for a 4-year-old who was excited to see her daddy after his long tour. She wanted to show him her new drawings, tell him about the pony she had ridden that afternoon, share all the little moments that had accumulated during his absence. Elvis, exhausted and chemically imbalanced from days of prescription abuse, saw his daughter's excitement as defiance. In his twisted state of mind, Lisa Marie's refusal to immediately obey bedtime instructions became a symbol of all the chaos he couldn't control in his life. The crowds he couldn't escape, the money he couldn't manage, the image he couldn't maintain, all of it crystallized into rage at a 4-year-old who just wanted to spend time with her father. Priscilla tried to mediate, suggesting they let Lisa Marie stay up for just a few more minutes. It was such a reasonable request, the kind of small compromise that normal families make every single day without thinking twice. But Elvis wasn't functioning as a normal father that night. The pills had stripped away his ability to process reasonable thoughts or control his emotional responses. The transformation in Elvis's face was terrifying to witness, his features contorted with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere deeper and darker than normal human emotion. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that made the staff members who could overhear from the next room instinctively step backward. Priscilla had seen him angry before, but this was something else entirely. This was rage mixed with pharmaceutical enhancement, creating a volatile combination that no one in the house knew how to handle. Lisa Marie sensed the change in atmosphere immediately. Children are remarkably intuitive about danger, and every instinct in her small body was screaming warnings. She moved closer to her mother, unconsciously seeking protection from the man who was supposed to be her protector. Her big eyes filled with tears she didn't understand, responding to emotions that were too complex and frightening for a child to process. The Elvis who had once serenaded millions with tender love songs was nowhere to be found that night. In his place stood a man consumed by pharmaceutical paranoia, convinced that everyone around him was conspiring against him, interpreting every action as a personal attack on his authority. Priscilla's simple suggestion about bedtime became evidence of her disloyalty and his twisted perspective. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The king of rock and roll opened his mouth and released words that would destroy his family forever. The explosion was about to begin, and there would be no stopping it once it started. Explosion, the words that shattered everything. Elvis erupted with the force of a volcano that had been building pressure for years. The eruption was sudden, violent, and devastating. His words were not the kind of angry words that flare up in ordinary arguments and then fade away. They were poisonous, carefully aimed to cut as deeply as possible into the woman who had once been his anchor. He accused Priscilla of being an unfit mother, of failing in her duty to protect and nurture Lisa Marie, and of poisoning their daughter's mind against him. Each accusation landed like a blow, designed not merely to wound, but to destroy. The subject of Lisa Marie was the spark that ignited this explosion. Priscilla had made a decision regarding their daughter's schedule, a decision Elvis disagreed with. What might have been a simple parental disagreement spiraled into a storm of paranoia and bitterness. The pills coursing through Elvis's system had twisted his thoughts into dark fantasies, convincing him that Priscilla wanted to steal Lisa Marie away from him forever. Then came the 7 words that would haunt the Presley family for the rest of their lives. In the middle of his tirade, his voice rising to a terrifying pitch, Elvis spat them out with such venom that even he seemed startled by their cruelty once they were spoken. Those words exposed the depths of his paranoia, the extent to which addiction had poisoned his mind against everyone he loved. They were words that could never be taken back, never explained away, never forgiven. Priscilla stood rooted to the floor, unable to believe what she was hearing. This man, the man who had once sworn to protect her, who had serenaded her with promises of eternal love, now stood before her as a stranger consumed by fury. The accusations were so outrageous, so detached from reality, that she could not even summon a response. All she could do was clutch Lisa Marie closer to her chest as the little girl began to sob, her cries piercing through the storm like the desperate plea of innocence caught in the crossfire. Members of the household staff who witnessed the confrontation later described it as one of the most disturbing scenes they had ever experienced within Graceland's walls. This was not a marital dispute. This was psychological warfare, unleashed by a man whose empathy and reason had been consumed by the haze of chemicals. It seemed almost as if Elvis wanted to annihilate Priscilla emotionally, believing her suffering would somehow ease his own torment. Lisa Marie's terrified screams finally cut through the chaos. For a moment it seemed as if the sound of his daughter's pain might awaken Elvis from the fog and bring him back to himself. But instead of calming him, it only fed his rage. To him, Lisa Marie's tears were not the result of his violence, but proof that Priscilla had turned their daughter against him. The atmosphere in Graceland grew heavy with dread. The home that had once been filled with laughter and music now felt poisoned, as if the walls themselves recoiled at the hatred being unleashed. Portraits of Elvis's past glories looked down in silent witness, unable to intervene as the king of rock and roll tore apart his own kingdom. For 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Elvis poured out years of paranoia, resentment, and pharmaceutical madness upon the two people who loved him most. When at last the storm subsided, silence fell like a shroud over the mansion. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Everyone waited, breath held, afraid that the slightest sound might set him off again. The damage, however, was irreversible. Words had been spoken that could never be unspoken. Trust had been shattered that could never be rebuilt. And in that night of fury, the king lost the very family he claimed to cherish most. Priscilla's defiance, the woman who wouldn't break. For 8 years, Priscilla had absorbed Elvis's anger, made excuses for his behavior, and sacrificed pieces of herself to keep the peace. But watching her 4-year-old daughter cry in terror from her father's verbal assault triggered something primal and powerful in Priscilla's heart. The frightened young woman who had once trembled at Elvis's raised voice suddenly transformed into a protective mother who would fight tigers with her bare hands to defend her child. When Elvis paused to take a breath in his tirade, expecting Priscilla to crumble as she had so many times before, she did something that shocked everyone in the room, including herself. She looked the king of rock and roll directly in the eyes and told him exactly what she thought of his behavior. Her voice was steady, clear, and filled with a strength that even she didn't know she possessed until that moment. The words that came out of Priscilla's mouth that night were the most honest she had ever spoken in their entire relationship. She told Elvis that his drug abuse was destroying their family, that his paranoia was making him see enemies where there were only people who loved him, and that she would not allow him to traumatize Lisa Marie with his chemically induced rages any longer. Elvis was so accustomed to immediate compliance from everyone around him that Priscilla's defiance left him temporarily speechless. No one had dared to challenge him so directly in years. The staff had learned to agree with everything he said. The friends had learned to enable his worst behaviors. Even the doctors had learned to write prescriptions without asking difficult questions. But Priscilla had just drawn a line in the sand and dared him to cross it. The power dynamic in the room shifted so dramatically that you could almost feel it in the air. For the first time in their relationship, Priscilla wasn't speaking as Elvis's wife or as the Lady of Graceland. She was speaking as Lisa Marie's mother, and that role gave her a strength that no amount of intimidation could shake. She had found her voice and her courage in the most unlikely moment. Elvis tried to reassert his authority with threats and demands, but something fundamental had changed between them. Priscilla was no longer afraid of him. She had seen him at his absolute worst and realized that his bark was actually worse than his bite. The man she had feared for so long was really just a frightened, sick addict who was lashing out because he had lost control of his own life. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, with Elvis becoming increasingly frustrated as his usual intimidation tactics failed to work. Priscilla matched his energy without raising her voice, responding to his accusations with facts, countering his emotional manipulation with logical arguments, refusing to be drawn into the chaos he was trying to create. By the time the argument finally ended, everyone in Graceland understood that something irreversible had occurred. Priscilla had stopped being Elvis's victim and had become his equal. The balance of power in the Presley household had shifted forever, and there would be no going back to the old dynamic no matter what happened next. Lisa Marie, the child who saw too much. 4-year-old Lisa Marie Presley huddled against her mother's legs, her small body trembling with confusion and fear as she watched the two most important people in her world tear each other apart with words that cut like knives. Children aren't supposed to witness such raw human emotion. aren't supposed to see their heroes revealed as flawed and dangerous, aren't supposed to carry the weight of adult problems on their tiny shoulders. The fight was far too complex for a preschooler to understand, but Lisa Marie could feel the hatred crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. She didn't know what the big words meant, didn't understand why Daddy was so angry, or why Mommy looked so scared and brave at the same time. All she knew was that her safe world was crumbling around her and there was nothing she could do to fix it. In her innocent mind, Lisa Marie tried to make sense of what was happening by applying the logic that 4-year-olds use to understand their universe. Maybe if she was extra good, Daddy would stop being mad. Maybe if she said sorry even though she didn't know what she was apologizing for, the yelling would stop. Maybe if she hugged Daddy really tight, he would remember that he loved her and Mommy and everything would go back to normal. The psychological impact of that night would follow Lisa Marie for the rest of her life. Years later, she would struggle with relationships, battle her own demons with substances, and carry scars from watching her father's public persona crumble in their private living room. The little girl who should have been protected from such adult horrors became an unwilling witness to the destruction of her family. When Elvis finally noticed his daughter's terrified tears, something flickered in his eyes that might have been recognition or shame or regret. For just a moment, the pharmaceutical haze lifted enough for him to see what his rage was doing to the child he claimed to love more than life itself. But instead of stopping the assault and comforting Lisa Marie, he seemed to interpret her tears as evidence that Priscilla had somehow turned their daughter against him. The most heartbreaking moment came when Lisa Marie, despite her terror, tried to intervene in the fight by tugging on Elvis's pants leg and asking him to please stop yelling at Mommy. Her tiny voice cutting through the adult chaos should have immediately ended the confrontation. Instead, it seemed to make Elvis even angrier, as if a 4-year-old's plea for peace was somehow another attack on his authority. Priscilla's protective instincts went into overdrive as she watched her daughter's innocence being shattered in real time. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to grab Lisa Marie and run as far away from Graceland as possible. The woman who had endured years of Elvis's abuse finally found her breaking point when she realized that his behavior was now traumatizing their child. That night changed Lisa Marie's relationship with both her parents forever. She would grow up knowing that the king of rock and roll was capable of cruelty, that fairy tale marriages could be nightmares, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you most. The little girl who should have been sleeping peacefully in her princess bedroom became a casualty of her parents' war. The aftermath, when kings fall. The morning after the explosion dawned gray and heavy, as though even the Memphis sky shared in mourning the devastation that had unfolded within the walls of Graceland. Elvis awoke in his master bedroom with the dull ache of a pharmaceutical hangover and the fragmented return of memories from the night before. The very pills that had fueled his volcanic outburst had blurred some details, but not enough to spare him from the weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. Priscilla had spent the long night in Lisa Marie's room, curled around their daughter and whispering reassurances that everything would be fine, even though she did not truly believe it herself. Each time Lisa Marie stirred in her sleep, she whimpered for her daddy. The sound cut into Priscilla's heart. A reminder of her child's innocent hope that morning would somehow heal what had been shattered beyond repair. The household staff moved through the mansion like silent ghosts. They tidied the physical remnants of the previous night's conflict while avoiding each other's eyes. Many of them had been with Elvis for years, some for decades, and they had always viewed him as a man of charm and generosity. To see him transformed into a figure of cruelty toward his own family had shaken them deeply, leaving them unsure of how to reconcile what they had witnessed with the man they thought they knew. Elvis's first instinct was to bury the memory, to smooth it over with the gestures that had always worked in the past. He sent flowers and lavish gifts, penned a brief note claiming he had been exhausted from touring, and ordered the staff to prepare Priscilla's favorite breakfast, as if peace could be bought with pastries and apologies. Yet deep inside, he knew these familiar tactics were woefully inadequate. No material gesture could erase the venomous words he had hurled only hours earlier. When he finally faced Priscilla that morning, the reality struck him harder than any hangover. She looked at him not with anger, but with a cold detachment he had never seen before. This was the woman who had always forgiven him, who had always found excuses for his moods, who had always placed his needs above her own. Now her eyes told him that something inside her had broken. She accepted his apology with formality, but her distance made it clear that words alone would never heal the wounds he had inflicted. Lisa Marie's reaction wounded him even more. The little girl who had once run to him with joyous squeals now lingered cautiously in the doorway, studying his face as if trying to determine which father stood before her. The trust that once lit her eyes had dimmed, replaced with uncertainty and fear. That night marked the beginning of the end. Though the legal unraveling would take months, Priscilla had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The fairy tale that enchanted the world had ended, leaving behind only the painful work of dismantling a marriage while trying to shield a child who had already seen far too much. The legacy: how one night changed history. The explosive confrontation between Elvis Presley and Priscilla in 1972 became the catalyst that permanently altered the most famous family in America. What began as a dispute over Lisa Marie's bedtime routines erupted into a storm that exposed the fractures beneath their glamorous image. It revealed the damage caused by unchecked control, pharmaceutical dependency, and years of unspoken resentment. The king of rock and roll, who had conquered audiences around the world, lost the most important battle of his life within the walls of his own home. For Priscilla, that night marked the beginning of transformation. She did not immediately become the strong, independent woman the public would later see, but the seed of change was planted. Until then, she had often believed that love meant tolerating pain, making excuses, and sacrificing her own needs for his. In the quiet aftermath of the explosion, she realized that real love required protecting herself and Lisa Marie from further harm. Slowly, she gathered the courage to stand her ground. That choice would not only shape her life, but also inspire countless women who saw in her story a reflection of their own. Lisa Marie, still a child, carried away emotional scars from that night. She had seen her parents' marriage unravel in front of her and heard the venom of words too heavy for a child's ears. Yet she also inherited her mother's resilience. The little girl who clung to her mother's side would later become a woman unwilling to accept toxic behavior in her own relationships. The trauma became a piece of her identity, but not the whole of it. It fueled her determination to demand honesty and strength from herself and others. For Elvis, the confrontation left a wound that never fully healed. The 7 words he had unleashed in the midst of pharmaceutical rage haunted him for the rest of his life. Friends and biographers described moments when Elvis broke down in tears while recalling that night, overwhelmed by regret for the way he had lashed out at the people he loved most. He understood too late that his obsession with control and his inability to master his addictions had cost him the very family he claimed to cherish above all else. The divorce that followed 6 months later was handled with as much dignity as 2 global figures could muster, but the damage was permanent. The carefully crafted image of America's royal family gave way to a more painful truth. Behind the glamour of Graceland was a household burdened by the same struggles that plagued ordinary families: addiction, abuse, mistrust, and heartbreak. The fairy tale ended not with happily ever after, but with the sober realization that even icons are human. Yet there was a lesson in the wreckage. The story reminds us that fame and fortune offer no immunity against the consequences of self-destruction. Control and abuse corrode even the strongest bonds. And sometimes the most courageous act of love is refusing to enable destruction any longer. Looking back today, that night at Graceland stands as a turning point. It reshaped the Presley legacy, transforming it from myth into a cautionary tale about celebrity, addiction, and the courage it takes to break cycles of harm. The 7 words Elvis Presley unleashed at Priscilla that night over Lisa Marie were never written down, but those who heard them say they were so vicious, so personal, that they shattered a marriage and scarred a child who only wanted her father's love. That night proved that even the king of rock and roll could not rule his own home through fear. His crown, once a symbol of triumph, became the weight that destroyed his kingdom from within. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden cost of fame and family conflict, share it with every Elvis fan you know. And tell us in the comments, do you believe this was the moment that truly ended Elvis and Priscilla forever?